There's a war in heaven in Revelation 12, and it might be happening soon. That and more in episode 2 of the Celestial Tapestry. Hi, I'm Matt, your tour guide as we continue to explore the Celestial Tapestry, God's story in the sky. When we left off, the woman had just given birth to a child, and the child is swept off to God and to his throne, avoiding the dragon that was waiting to eat it. We saw how the woman is a constellation Virgo, the dragon is a constellation Scorpius, and the child is a comet with the catchy name Shuchinshan Atlas, c. 2023 A3. The story continues in Revelation 12:7. Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. So picking up from episode 1, our woman's child, the comet A3, has just been born, but it's avoided being devoured by the dragon, Scorpius, by being caught up into heaven. If we follow the comet's course from Virgo to heaven, we see it land in the constellation Ophiuchus. We briefly mentioned it in episode 1, but let's take a second to talk about myths and symbolism here. Most, if not all, of the constellations have one or more myths associated with them. These myths can go back thousands of years, and they can span multiple cultures. We're going to be looking at lots of different cultures and myths during our journey, and they may skip around some. Most of the myths descend from a common starting place in the ancient Near East. We're talking Mesopotamian, Assyrian, and Babylonian in the earlier myths, to Greek and Roman myths at the time of John's writing. While we don't pay much attention to myth in our modern society, people in the ancient world most certainly did. We're going to be seeing that God is using these myths and the symbolism associated with them and this common understanding to tell his story to all of us across time. Again, we don't believe in the mythology of these things, but we see the associated stories as a sort of common shorthand that transcends time, language, and culture. Make sense? Okay, so back to Ophiuchus. The comet/child flies toward Ophiuchus, or as John says, to God and his throne. The constellation Ophiuchus doesn't represent God, but the symbolism associated with it places it squarely in the heavenly realm. Let's see why. As we continue with chapter 12, verse 7, we see a war arising in heaven. Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon and his angels. Let's take another look at Ophiuchus. Ophiuchus, in many myths, but particularly in the early Greek myths, is pictured as a man wrestling or fighting a serpent. In the Greek, sometimes it's Apollo, and sometimes it's Asclepius, but the point is that it's a man fighting a serpent. So here we have Ophiuchus' body, and his arm, and here's the snake that extends on either side of him, almost like it's going behind him. The snake part of the constellation is called Serpens. Looks like a guy fighting a snake to me, too. So symbolically, we have a war in heaven, from verse 7. In verse 8, we see the dragon lose the war in heaven. And in verse 9, we see clearly that the dragon, that ancient serpent, is none other than Satan. He and his buddies are cast down to earth, once and for all, as it turns out. This is the very picture of the battle with the serpent and Ophiuchus. One more bit about the imagery and the myth of this ancient constellation. Ophiuchus is supposed to be trampling the constellation beneath him. What's under his feet? You got it. It's Scorpius. Some of us might see some symbolism there too. So he's a guy fighting a snake, stomping on the dragon of our story. It's a brawl. Let's keep reading. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, "Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. For they loved not their lives even unto death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short." There's no notable sky imagery here, but there are some interesting things to consider. This is where you may begin to see some of our preconceived notions challenged around Satan and his fall. First, Satan has had access to God and his throne day and night. That's in verse 10. He's been accusing the angels' brothers before God for a long time, it sounds like. Who are their brothers? Well, verse 11 tells us. They, the brothers, have conquered Satan by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. Some of them have even followed Jesus, the Lamb, into death. The brothers are Christians. This is going to challenge our thinking. Many of us have been taught that Satan fell to earth never to return to heaven at the beginning of creation. But we see here, and we see in other places in the Bible, that this doesn't appear to be the case. Or at least not fully. Take the story of Job, for instance. Here's what it says in Job, chapter 1. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." So Satan has been roaming the earth, but he's also gathered with all the other angels in what is presumably heaven, talking to God. Satan has had access to the throne all along, and his expulsion is after people have come to follow Jesus and have died for his name's sake. That's here in verse 11. In fact, in context, I think this is an end times event. This might not be what we've always been taught, but John appears to be telling us that it's true. Let's keep looking. Verse 12. Everyone is rejoicing in heaven because Satan is finally gone. Sounds like he's been a real pain up there also, but it's less than stellar news, no pun intended, for the earth. Satan has been cast down to earth, and he's furious because he knows that his time is short. He's about to go on a rampage. Satan's goal from this point forward is to destroy anything and anyone that bows to God. He knows he's done for. He's going to cause as much disruption and destruction as possible before his time is up. There's one thing I think is significant to see in the sky in relation to this part of the story and this constellation. There's going to be a supernova, a literal exploding star in the constellation of Corona Borealis. Here. Corona means crown. It's right over the head of the snake that Ophiuchus is wrestling. The star that's going to explode is called T Coronae Borealis, and it lights up once every 80 years. Astronomers expect it any day now, and as of this recording, in early October of 2024, it's overdue. It's going to show up at some point, we just don't know when. Not exactly, but I personally wouldn't be surprised if it went off around the same time as our child comet flies into the Ophiuchus constellation. We'll see how my prediction ages. Again, just a suspicion, but there's something interesting to look for. Is that significant? Maybe. As with all of the things that we're showing you, it's an interesting part of the bigger story. It may be a signal that this part of the narrative is happening, just like the comet in Virgo may indicate that that part of the story is happening. But it might also not mean anything. I said in the previous video that only time will tell if any of the astronomical events are significant in any way to our story's timing. Meaning, are these things happening now in real life? It's another piece to watch. If this happens around the time the comet is in Ophiuchus, it's one more big coincidence that adds to the whole. Let's cover a couple of theological things as we wrap this video up. God's been telling us for thousands of years how his story of redemption is going to play out. There's prophecy after prophecy about it across the full breadth of the Bible. God seems to not only tell us, but to also preview events for us at different times. We sort of get a picture that looks like now, but not yet. A past or current fulfillment that teases the final event. One of the easiest ways to understand this concept is in the way Jesus talks about the kingdom of God. He comes to earth the first time and tells us, the kingdom's here. Yet we know that he's coming to set up his literal earthly rule at the end of the age, a future event. He tells his disciples this in Matthew 24, and we see it throughout the Bible. So we see that the kingdom is both now, but not yet. God appears to do this repeatedly across Scripture when dealing with prophecy. We talked about the fall of Satan in this episode. In the last episode, we saw the woman pregnant with the Messiah. In both cases, I think we're seeing symbolism that displays this now but not yet thing that God does. For Satan, he rebelled against God at the beginning and received a curse along with Eve. But the timing of his final demise appears to be a future thing. We aren't given much insight into how God's heavenly realm works. Who knew there could be a war in heaven? I'm sure some of you are protesting that Satan's already fallen and can quote verses to prove it. I agree with you. Satan has fallen. What's less clear, though, is what that means. Positionally, he's done for, but we see him with access to the throne throughout the Bible. John seems to be telling us that his final, absolute banishment is a future event reserved for the end of the age. So Satan's fall is now, but not yet. It's an interesting subject. I encourage you to really examine the verses you know about this. In context, you might be surprised at what they say. Leave me a comment below if you have thoughts on it. For the woman in Revelation 12, Israel, John says she's groaning in labor pains, about to produce her Messiah. We know that Israel gave birth to Jesus 2,000 years ago, but in prophecy, Israel is described as a nation groaning in labor pains for deliverance from her enemies right before the Messiah comes to conquer them and establish his physical rule over all the nations of the earth. Not just metaphorically, but for real. He's going to rule with a rod of iron, forcing the whole world to submit to him. This is a future event. So in Revelation 12, the woman's groaning in labor is referencing a past, yet future event. Now, but not yet. My point with this is that I believe John's narrative in Revelation 12 has 3 layers to it. It's metaphorically telling the story of God's plan for the redemption of the world across all of human history. God sends the Messiah, he's born, died, resurrected, taken away to heaven to return later. But it's also a description of events at the end of the age, future events, but maybe not as future as we think. In the story at the end of the age, Israel is groaning for deliverance from her enemies. The Messiah comes forth to deal with her enemies in both heaven and earth, establishing his kingdom forever. And thirdly, the imagery in Revelation 12 is a literal astronomical roadmap to the heavens. John gives us landmarks in the sky to observe as these things unfold. Exact descriptions of the stars and other heavenly bodies that help us understand God's timing and the story of his work across time, but specifically at the end. How amazing is the Lord! He's told us about his plan, and he shows it to us in the sky. It's the ultimate drama, and he's written it down for us in his words and in his creation. Think for a moment about his incredible power. What sort of being is capable of doing something like that? Planning and implementing an intentional work that spans all of history, ending at a singular point in time that the heavenly creation points to. And why would a being that can do that care about us and love us enough to send himself as a final full measure of forgiveness for all of mankind, to love us and to gather us to himself at the end of the age? How great is the Lord? And on that, I guess that's it for this one. Thanks for sticking with me. We covered a lot, and there's a lot more to see in the sky and in the scriptures. Next time, we'll see an unnerving picture of a horseman in the stars. You'll know him when you see him. Please don't forget to subscribe so you can stay up to date. And if you enjoyed this video or found it useful, please hit like. Also, we read comments, so comment below. Thanks for watching. See you next time.